Hello guys, today we're going to be talking about Africa. I'll be teaching today on how early Africa was conquered and dominated. Now there were two basic methods through which the early Africans were actually conquered in a way and lost their systems and their values and their way of life. One of them was by religion and the other was by battle, by really conquest. And by religion, it's accredited especially to Chancellor William, the guy who wrote the book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, that early Africans were really religious people. They were really religious, and so the tone of religion actually sounded really um, in line with what they really knew. They sounded familiar to their modes of thought and reasoning. And remember, when I say the early Africans were a religious people, you have to think about what it means to be a religious person. A religious person is a person who believes in a system of values, right? And religion in itself is a system of values, is a system of faith or a system of belief, which is different from spirituality. Being religious is actually different from being spiritual. Spirituality actually defines the parameters for accessibility to truth. But religion in itself is actually a system. So being a religious person means aligning yourself to a system, a set of systems to which, you know, a system of worship is really established. And so first came the crescent of Islam. Um, the Islam nation, or the Islamic nation at the time, approached Africa, proselytizing most of the early Africans. There were forceful conversions and there were massive intermarriages, especially between the African women and the Muslims, and also concubinage. And after that came Western Christianity. But you must remember that in the 4th century, there was already Christianity that was without Western imperialism in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, they had already created this sort of Christianity in which Western imperialism was absent. But the imperialism, the Christianity which later came into Africa at the time, happened to not simply spread the message of Jesus and his own father, but in a way it appeared that the object of worship eventually became the West and Western civilization. In other words, the Africans were converted into Christianity to be made to worship a system of or way of life, the ideas of the West, the values and the systems of the West, so to speak, of Western civilization. And so with these massive campaigns of conversion and converting the early Africans into these two sects of religion, what happened was that a lot of the early Africans lost their self-concept, and self-realization at that point eventually depended on if you were converted to either Islam or Christianity. And so gradually the self-identity of the African was lost, so to speak, as most of the people had their ideas and the values. They had to unlearn what they knew before, and they had to relearn these new ideas and values and systems of Western civilization. And most of the early African institutions, the courts, the cultural institutions basically were made to be seen as archaic and, uncivilized, so to speak. And so society was gradually wiped out in this manner. And so what happened was that it kind of like led to self-hatred, so to speak, because also their names were also changed to either Arabic or Caucasian names, through which they adopted a new persona, and anything that had to do with Africa was eventually disdained, so to speak. And so in a way, this kind of like eroded the massive, prowess of the basic institutions of the basic African society. The values of communitarianism and doing things together actually shifted into a new mode of thought, or a new mode of doing things. Now, the second way in which they were conquered was really through battle, and this one really interests me a lot, because the concept of spies, as we see in modern contemporary battles, as we saw a lot in the First and the Second World Wars, was actually an age-long concept in which the early traders in Africa, the early Asian and European traders, actually had to send sort of spies to actually go into the continent to kind of like really learn about what the continent actually encapsulates, what kind of people live there, their ways of lives, and their way of doing things, you see. And there were 6 reports that actually really interest me, which these spies actually brought back to the conquerors, or to the Asians and the Europeans, which inspired them to believe that conquering Africa was really possible. And I'll read them, they're really interesting. The first one was that Africans were largely peaceful people who engaged in agriculture, mining, trading, fishing, and crafts such as pottery and other little manufacturing activities. The second was that they had a highly developed social and political systems, which actually showed the sign of a highly civilized, of a high civilization. The third was that they were ill prepared for war, especially except against their neighbors who used similar weapons with them, like bows and arrows and spears and these other primitive weapons, which probably the Europeans and the Asians at that time had really attained advancements upon. The fourth was that they had no swift moving mounted soldiers. That it was compared that 100 cavalry men, foot soldiers, could actually wipe off 10,000 Africans at the time. And the fifth report was that they were very secretive people, that they were fully aware of the resources in which the continent encapsulated, but they were really unwilling to engage in commerce, in foreign trade, which would benefit them more. Most of the resources that actually they had within the continent was actually used for personal adornment rather than a trade, in a way, so to speak. And the sixth report was that the entire continent could be easily run over, because it was made up of really these really small independent states, but I'll call them chiefdoms, because they were really led by chiefs, and these independent chiefdoms really lacked unity. There was no unity among them, because each chief knew that his responsibility was to protect his people, and by attaining or pursuing unity with another chief kind of like created a sense of weakness. And so that pride actually made them decide to sustain the compactability of their individual chiefdoms. And they maintained their states as really small chiefdoms, which eventually made it easy for conquering, so to speak. And so in conclusion, I would say that these two methods were the methods that were widely employed to the conquest of early Africa. And to me, it's interesting that I still see in modern African society today some of these traits which actually echo the reasonings of the past. They echo the society of the past, in which, you know, we could argue that the past actually still lives today in the present in Africa. And then if real sustainable change could be achieved on the African continent, some of these issues which I've mentioned in this video need to be revised in order to be able to understand where we have been and understand if where we have been is actually still with us today, and help us to probably think ahead for a better future, or for the attainment of a different alternative future. But I'll catch you in the next one, guys. Shalom.